Good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Alice Van Ommeren and Casey Greaney. My name is Jamie Madsen and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I'll also be your host for the evening. Copperfield's Books has been committed to literature, education, and creating community together since our founding in 1981. I'm thrilled to remind everyone that all 9 of our stores remain open for both inside service and curbside pickup throughout this holiday season. And I always like to take a moment here to thank all of you for supporting us during this COVID-19 challenge. We have so much gratitude here at Copperfield's Books, and I just want to thank you all. So just a couple housekeeping items before we get started this evening. I will be using the chat box to provide links to view upcoming Copperfield's events, details for purchasing tonight's title, as well as links to purchase previous works by Alice, and will also include my contact details for post-event information. Additionally, we will be using the Q&A box tonight. That will be your go-to with any questions or comments for the speakers. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A icon. Please go ahead and submit your questions here rather than replying to my post in the chat box. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce tonight's authors. Alice Van Ommeren is a historian and postcard collector who resides in our very own Petaluma. Her previous publications include Stockton and Vintage Postcards and Yosemite's Historic Camps and Hotels. In conversation tonight with her is Casey Greaney. Casey holds a master's degree in U.S. history and is a longtime Petaluma resident and community member. They're with us this evening to discuss their brand new title, Petaluma and Vintage Postcards. I'm sure many of you locals, as well as myself, are excited to dive right in. So I'm gonna just go ahead and hand it over to you ladies.
Well, thank you, Jamie, for that gracious welcome. And we're gonna start first with Alice, and we'll be taking turns throughout the presentation to tell you about our postcard book and showcase some of the postcards from the book. So now I'll go off screen and let Alice kick us off.
Thank you for joining us on this Friday evening. I'm going to start off a little bit by answering since we started doing the book and since I've been collecting postcards for some time, some of the most frequently asked questions that we get, specifically related to postcard collecting, the different types of postcards that are out there, how the idea of the book kind of came about, the process of developing the book. And then I'll turn it over to Casey, who's going to give some background on the history of Petaluma. And then we'll just kind of go back and forth and talk about our favorite postcards and just interesting tidbits that we've learned about the postcards. So, so the first question is that we always get is, where do you find postcards? And one of the most favorite places to find postcards is actually at postcard shows. I'm going to move away from the screen a little bit. And this is actually just as stamp shows and coin shows, there's also something called postcard shows. And so this is what you're seeing here is usually they're in large halls, and there's vendors, and all they do is sell postcards. And as you can see, they're kind of in boxes. And then for somebody that collects Petaluma postcards, I would go to a postcard show, and I would, just look under Sonoma County. And again, they're all categorized by topic, and so that's kind of the easiest way to do it. Some other places to find postcards is also online. So there's vendors actually have websites that you can buy postcards on, or actually online auctions, such as eBay is probably the best example of that. And those are easy ways to do. And all you have to do is type in Petaluma postcards, and you get a good selection of postcards. And so online is another option for purchasing vintage postcards. People always ask me about like antique shops or antique fairs, because you do see a lot of postcards at those events as well. The hard part about those is that usually we're looking for postcards in a certain topic. So for me to see a box of postcards at an antique shop, and if I'm looking for Petaluma postcards, it's going to be very unlikely that I might get lucky and find a postcard. But so, if you're specifically collecting on a certain topic, antique shops or antique fairs are kind of hard. There are postcard collectors out there. When you ask a postcard collector, what do you collect? Some postcard collectors will say, what don't I collect? So it all depends. People have all kinds of, different topics that they collect postcards. So I'm a pretty avid postcard collector. As Jamie mentioned, I've 2 other books, Stockton Vintage Postcards and Yosemite's Historic Hotels and Camps. I'm also the newsletter editor of the San Francisco Bay Area Postcard Club. So there's actually a club where postcard collectors gather and share collecting stories. So since I moved to Petaluma, I also started collecting Petaluma cards, and it was a great opportunity to learn more about my new hometown. And it quickly dawned on me that I think Petaluma needed a postcard book, and so that's really what came about. Casey's a longtime resident and actually a trained historian, and either to collaborate on this, we had a nice collaboration between the 2 of us in producing this book. And so that was kind of like a little bit about the process that we had to that. Other postcard sources specifically for our book. The Petaluma Museum has a collection of postcards, so we worked with them and went through their collection. Also, the Sonoma County History and Genealogy Library has a great collection, so we went through their archives and looked at their Petaluma postcards. We also reached out to 3 postcard collectors. Lou Bear, who's a longtime collector and a postcard guru, really. He actually lives in Pengrove and has an excellent Petaluma collection. We also reached out to Craig Blackstone. He's a Sonoma County postcard collector. He has a very impressive collection. And actually, he was the largest source of our postcards that are in our book that are not ours. And then we also used a couple of postcards from Gail Unzelman. She's a wine historian, and she's a collector of winery postcards. And so between the 2 museums and between the museum, the library, and the 3 collectors, we had about 600 postcards to look at. As far as that was kind of our universe. Half of those were from our own collection, so about 300 postcards were of our own. And then we really looked at kind of the which postcards would reproduce really well in black and white. So that was important. As you might have seen the book, some of the postcards are in color, but when they produce the book, they're reproduced in black and white. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Some of it is the cost. Printing color is much more expensive. And actually, most of the postcards are originally black and white. They're often colored in. So black and white reproduction was really important in looking at the postcards. And so we looked at the 600 postcards or so, certain themes started emerging. And so postcards of churches and schools and civic buildings. And so those were kind of the predictable type of topics. Other postcards were pretty unique to Petaluma. So the big prominence of the poultry industry was unique to Petaluma. And then as you go through our presentation tonight, you'll become familiar with some of the parades and some of the fanfare around the world's egg basket. And so, Petaluma poultry postcards were very prominent in our book. So we selected 200 cards and divided it up in 10 chapters and kind of took it from there. And so that was a little bit about kind of our process for developing the book. Some of the other questions that we often get is, what is the oldest postcard in the book? Or what's the oldest postcard in our collection? So just to kind of remind you that postcards before 1898, only the governments could issue postcards. So the postcards that were in existence were only used by government to send out notices to people. And in 1898, actually, Congress authorized private printers to start printing postcards and selling postcards. And we were allowed to start mailing them. So the individuals, the public was allowed to start using postcards. So 1898 is about the earliest that we can see that. They weren't called postcards at that time. They were actually called private mailing cards. And 1 cent stamp, and there it went. What's unique about these very, very early postcards is that you could not write anything on the back of the postcard. The back was only used for the address. And so the front of the postcard, you could write on it. And these very old postcards, as you see here, this one is from Petaluma from 1905. The writing is on the right side in this case. So you see those very, very early postcards where you could only use the back for the address and not for writing anything. So this is a good example. The great writing on this, it says "too busy to write," and then he signed his name. So this one was sent in May 10th, 1905. The other thing that's interesting, they started off being called private mailing cards, but in 1901 they actually used the term postcard, and it actually was 2 words, post and card. And eventually today you see it as 1 word. So in 1907, Congress allowed the use of the back of the postcard. And this was really a breakthrough where you can start using the full front of the postcard for the picture. And you didn't have to write the message on the front, you could just write it on the back. And this is called the divided back era of postcards. And so where you actually see, the address on one side and the writing on the other side. So this is really where millions of cards were being published during this 1907 era. It became a very popular hobby. It's really called the Golden Age of Postcards. Most cards were actually printed in Germany. Germans had some advanced lithographic processes, and some of these very, very beautiful cards were actually made in Germany by printers there. And here's a great example of the divided back postcard. You can see a lot of detail, a lot of color. You're starting to see people in there. These are really kind of the very beautiful cards. 1914, World War I started, and so that really stopped the production of code postcards in Germany, the exchange between that. So 1914 kind of ended the golden age of postcards. And here you see this postcard is of the Carnegie Public Library, or the Petaluma Museum that we know now. This was built in 1906 by Brainerd Jones. And while I'm speaking about the Petaluma Museum, I do want to mention that this book was, we had full support from the inception of this book. We had a lot of research support from the library, or from the museum, I should say. And then also we were able to use their cards. They also helped with editing of the book. And the royalties of this book are actually going back to the museum to continue the preservation of historic Petaluma. So like I said, World War I kind of ended the production of postcards in Germany. And in the United States, started to see if they could produce their own postcards. It was very high cost of labor and really didn't have the experience that we had. And you see kind of an era of very poor quality postcards. This is a great example. It's called a white border card. There's less ink. They're cheaper to produce. Look at the title, Greetings from Petaluma, very generic. And so you're starting to see lower quality cards after 1914. There definitely was kind of a resurgence. People tried different linen postcards were introduced, trying different ways to entice people to get back into postcards. And it wasn't really until 1939 when Union Oil Company put out the first photochrome or chrome postcard in their service stations. So you started to see postcards for sale in gas stations. And there were high quality, detailed images, shiny surface. I mean, those are the cards that we see today. And this example is actually of the chicken pharmacy on Petaluma Boulevard. It's the only store of its kind, and it opened in 1923. So this is a great example of a photochrome postcard, kind of in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. We're starting to see those. One other postcard type that is the real photo postcard, and this is a great example of it. Amateur photographer, and they could get it printed on postcard paper. And this is really 1903, as you recall. That's when the Kodak film was introduced, and so we're starting to see these great real photo postcards. This is a great example of it. A lot of details, photos turned into postcards, and these are the real gems. So when you start looking at postcards, and you'll notice through these presentations too that we used a lot of real photo postcards because they're just really nice, clear pictures. So I'm going to turn it over to Casey, who's going to talk a little bit about a brief history of Petaluma.
Okay, and we're going to start with this image and this card. As Alice mentioned, ours is not a history book, but rather a postcard book with images that illustrate some of Petaluma's history. Of course, there is a lot of history that is not documented in postcards because the cards were not available until the end of the 1800s. So, for example, we couldn't find any postcards of the Coast Miwok peoples who lived in and around Petaluma for thousands of years before outsiders encroached. Of course, there were few Coast Miwok around at the time postcards started taking prominence in mailing messages to people because their numbers had been decimated. Some of the outsiders who encroached came from Russia. Russians scouted the Sonoma coast, but settled on a site 13 miles north of what we call the Russian River. Fort Ross was a trading post, but with 2 bastions and 41 cannons, it appeared to be a military stronghold. We have Fort Ross and the Russians to thank for the settlement of Petaluma by non-native peoples. You see, the Spanish and the Mexican governments worried that the Russians were aiming to take over Alta California. Mission San Francisco Solano de Sonoma, or the Sonoma Mission, was founded in 1823. It was the last of the 21 Franciscan missions and the only one established under Mexican rule. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, or General Vallejo, was an officer of the Spanish and then the Mexican military, and he was charged with secularizing the mission in Sonoma and settling the North Bay to stave off the Russians. In 1833, young Ensign Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo scouted the North Bay to determine where best to establish a town. Here is what he said upon reaching Petaluma. And this was in a letter he sent back to his Mexican superiors about Petaluma. He said, "I have made it to paradise, the fairest land in all the world. Nothing in all California was comparable. Everything was ready-made for civilization. Soil, climate, abundant water, a great harbor, opportunity for commerce with the world, and for landscape, for variety, a land of pure enchantment." He ended up deciding that Sonoma was the best location for a town, but he built his own rancho in Petaluma, and on it the largest adobe structure at the time in Alta California. As the Mexican government was quite short on cash, they granted land as payment. The Rancho Petaluma stretched from the Petaluma River east to the town of Sonoma, from the San Pablo Bay to just south of Santa Rosa. So it was a huge swath of land. And incidentally, as a Mexican government official, Vallejo was able to grant land to other people as well, including his mother-in-law, Maria Carrillo, who was granted the land that is now Santa Rosa. The first major port on the Petaluma River was established by Vallejo, where the Adobe Creek met the Petaluma Creek. Vallejo ferried goods, particularly hides and tallow, to San Francisco for worldwide shipment. But then this thing called the gold rush happened, which caused quick settlement of Petaluma. Why here in Petaluma, so far from the gold mines? 3 words: location, location, location. The earliest white settlers took advantage of the ample wildlife around the area and shipped game meat to San Francisco down the Petaluma Creek. Farming and ranching followed. Basically, Petaluma provisioned San Francisco. In fact, in the mid to late 1800s, Petaluma Creek was the 3rd largest shipping waterway in all of California, after the Sacramento and San Joaquin Delta rivers. You can see in this slide the first Washington Street Bridge, which was built in 1857 by Thomas Hopper, who had conveniently purchased 270 acres from Vallejo east of the river. And after he built this bridge providing access to town from the east side, he sold subdivisions of his land at quite a tidy profit. The Petaluma Creek was technically a tidal slough and required improvement to allow for shipping. Early on, Chinese laborers were used to straighten the river by digging channels between some turns. As far back as 1878, Congress was petitioned for $25,000 to dredge and widen the creek. In 1959, the creek was declared to be a river by an act of Congress in order to qualify the waterway for federally funded dredging. With the advent of the railroad, Petaluma's prosperity accelerated. Petaluma was where water and rail met. It had the advantage of location, first as a port and second because of the railroad connections. This image shows a spur of the Petaluma and Santa Rosa railroads at the location of the turning basin. Another railroad, the San Francisco and North Pacific, connected to McNear Landing, which was a channel parallel to the Petaluma Creek that McNear paid to have dug out to accommodate steamers like the one in this postcard, which were used to ferry passengers as well as freight. And in the background on the right, you can see the silk mill that's still standing today. This is the initial San Francisco and Northern Pacific Depot. It was replaced in 1914 by the Northwest Pacific Railroad with the depot we still have in town today. The Northwest Pacific Railroad had acquired the main lines in Petaluma prior to building the new depot. Note the horse-drawn carriage in the foreground on the right. Postcards were used for advertising early on. This one promotes overnight shipping between San Francisco and Sebastopol via the port of Petaluma. As the railroads were developed, the population expanded in inland areas. The population of Santa Rosa surpassed that of Petaluma by the late 1800s, but Petaluma was still far more prosperous. Alice will now show you how that prosperity was illustrated in postcard images.
So one of the things that you're going to see here in the next postcards is not only the prominence or the affluence of Petaluma, but also what postcards kind of reveal changes over time. So for example, this is Main Street looking north from Western Avenue. And the postcard is mailed in 1910. And you're seeing, you know, horse and carriage. You're seeing the Petaluma National Bank on the left there here, which was actually there from 1903 to 1926. And anyway, so this is a great a view of Main Street that we're seeing here. This is kind of the same view here. This is Main Street looking north also, but in 1922. And we can still see the original clock tower there on the left on top of the Masonic Lodge building. This is actually the cover of the book. This is a great postcard. But you're kind of seeing it in the 20s now, and you're seeing the changes over time related to Main Street. And this is Main Street in the 1950s. Actually, Main Street was renamed Petaluma Boulevard in 1958. And now you see the new clock tower, which actually was built in 1934. So you see a different clock tower. And then the bank building is now the American Trust Company, which was built in 1926, also known as Vintage Antiques. So 3 different shots of Main Street, looking at, quite prominent downtown, but postcards really reveal kind of the changes over time. And again, this is an example also of a photochrome or a chrome postcard as well. So postcards really kind of give you some sense of what was important to a town, what was significant in the community. And often photographers would go to the Chamber of Commerce and ask at the local town and ask, what is significant in this community? And most Arcadia books on towns have chapters on places of worship. And so postcards of churches or places of worship was really quite common during those days. And I love this postcard here of, it's a multi-view postcard, and it really captures 10 of the early Petaluma churches in 1915. And so this is a nice, nice postcard with multi-view of churches. School buildings were also a source of pride. And this is actually a real photo postcard of the 3rd Petaluma High School building. It was on Fair Street. It was completed in 1915. It was actually torn down in 1958 to make room for the more expansive Petaluma High School that we have now. So a lot of historic buildings were torn down in the late 50s, 60s or so. And so one of the things that you can get from postcards is you can really get views of buildings that are no longer there. And so that's kind of unique. And speaking of demolished buildings, when I saw this postcard and I went, wow, there was this really nice Victorian brick building, City Hall. What happened? And this was demolished in 1955. Again, kind of 50s, 60s urban renewal when a lot of old buildings were torn down at that time. And so this was located on Kentucky Street and is now a parking lot. So again, postcards give you just a really good sense of buildings that are no longer dead. And to make Casey's point, the City Hall for that kind of a small town made look like Petaluma was quite prominent during that. A lot of postcards on like recreation activities as well. This is the Petaluma Golf and Country Club. I didn't even know Petaluma had a golf club. So when I saw this, Casey and I jumped into the car and immediately went over to look at it. It has a beautiful view of overseas Petaluma. This postcard was actually mailed in 1932, and the building was by Brainerd Jones, a famous Petaluma architect. And it's a 9-hole golf course. And the land for the golf course was donated by George McNear. And he's actually standing in this postcard over there on the right. He donated the land for the golf course and the golf club. And so this is a great fun postcard for showing some kind of recreational type of building activities that was important. Lots of parks. So there's a lot of postcards of parks and probably half a chapter on those. So parks were very important to people. This is originally Upper Plaza. At some point became Hill Plaza. Now it's Penry Park. And it's a great 1911 view of the park. So one of the things I've been doing is kind of exploring the Sonoma County kind of wine industry, and come to find out, Petaluma had a substantial number of wineries in the mid 1800s or so. Besides great climate and soil, Petaluma was also a great location along the water and rail to San Francisco. And so it was the perfect location for Blackman and Jacoby Winery. This is actually a 10-acre site along the Northwest Pacific Railroad. So actually on the northwest corner of Washington and Lakeville. And so this winery was actually used, a lot of it was used for blending and storing wine that was coming from other parts of Sonoma County. And then either along the river or along the rail went on to San Francisco. So Lackawanna and Jacoby actually, where they had their main office wasn't actually in San Francisco. They were using Petaluma as kind of an outpost. So this is a great postcard of the wine. And since we're on the topic of alcoholic beverages, the first county, this is not part of that brewery, West, which was Street, and was founded by George Crease. And again, these are just all examples of Petaluma's prosperity, including kind of thriving industries that made Petaluma, as small as a town as it was, quite prominent during that time. And I will let Casey talk a little bit more about the prominence of Petaluma industries and sites.
So Petaluma was the largest and by far the most affluent town in Sonoma County in the mid to late 1800s. In fact, the first banks in Sonoma County were established in Petaluma, the very first in 1865 by Isaac Wickersham. That's, however, not in this postcard. This postcard shows the Bank of Sonoma County on the right. It was located on the northwest corner of Washington and Maine. There are many scenes of Petaluma's prosperity documented in postcards beyond the Victorian homes and stately civic structures. This image shows the interior of both these, which still exists today. Note the well-stocked shelves and the well-heeled children. There were many thriving downtown businesses, including many luxury goods, such as candy, soda, cigars. There were hotels and banks and many other retail businesses. Oh, and there were also 27 saloons in 1870. At that time, the population of Petaluma was less than 2,000. So that was one saloon for every 70 people, including men, women, and children. Perhaps that's why prohibition efforts were strong in Petaluma. This particular image shows Morrow's Confections and Ice Cream, with Annie Morrow as the likely driver of the truck, which advertises ice cream, candies, and peanuts. In addition to ongoing agricultural pursuits, diverse larger industries were established in Petaluma. This image shows the interior of the Belden Brothers Silk Mill, which eventually became Sunset Line and Twine, and today is a Hampton Inn. But Petaluma also had multiple lumber and planing mills, wagon and buggy manufacturers, flour mills, oil wells, breweries, a foundry, harness and saddleries, tin shop, cooperage, soap factories, and the like. With such successful and diverse industries, Petaluma was declared the commercial metropolis of Sonoma County in the 1897 Illustrated Atlas of Sonoma County. But that was going to change. The change was small at first. Early settlers found that conditions in Petaluma were ideal for chicken farming and egg production, with a mild year-round climate, sandy loam soil on the west side, and the river and railroad providing access to outside markets. Initially, families raised poultry for their own consumption and sold surplus meat and eggs. But things changed. Reportedly, in 1900, 9/10 of Petaluma residents were raising poultry, and related industries in town were thriving. Chicken ranches came to dominate Petaluma, and they grew in scale and size. In 1905, nearly 46 million eggs were shipped from Petaluma. And yes, people kept track of these things. By the mid-1920s, Petaluma shipped an estimated 264 million eggs annually. Petaluma seemed justified in calling itself the chicken and egg capital of the world. This image shows the pioneer hatchery ranch. So what caused the proliferation of the poultry industry in Petaluma? Well, in addition to an ideal location, some critical innovations were developed by Petalumans which revolutionized the industry, not just locally, but eventually worldwide. And these innovations are documented in postcard images. The first such innovation was the incubator. In 1877, Isaac Diaz and Lyman Weiss created the Petaluma Incubator Company. Others elsewhere had developed rudimentary incubators, but the first commercially viable one was the Petaluma Incubator. By 1897, more than 15,000 Petaluma incubators had been sold to a world market. This particular early incubator in this image shows that they could handle maybe a few dozen chicks, maybe 2 dozen chicks at the most. The success of the incubator spurred additional innovation. Incubators replaced mother hens sitting on clutches of eggs to keep them warm until hatched. But after they hatched, with no mother hen to keep them warm and alive, a machine was developed to replace brooding hens, called the mechanical brooder. Christopher Nissen, a Danish immigrant and Petaluma chicken rancher, is credited with developing the first known mechanical brooder, but the technology quickly evolved and brooders grew in scale. You can see this particular brooder boasts that it is keeping warm 1,700 chicks. So the scale definitely grew and eventually became much more industrialized when commercial hatcheries really entered the scene. This image shows the interior of the large-scale Petaluma hatchery. In 1898, the same Christopher Nissen who had developed the mechanical brooder opened the very first commercial hatchery in town, the Pioneer Hatchery. Around 1900, there were 6 commercial hatcheries operating in Petaluma. By the 1920s, that number grew to 2 dozen. This advertising postcard shows the Must Hatch hatchery encompassing an entire city block. The main office building still stands today. So the Must Hatch hatchery used the tagline, "A greater birthplace for a greater chick." The back of the same advertising postcard gives further information on the scale of the operation. 1,250,000 chicks hatched annually. Also for sale, just hatched chicks which could be shipped. Laying white leghorns, pullets, hens, and cockerels for breeding. As the poultry industry grew, Petaluma became a hub of avian science with the goal of maximizing production. In 1903, the California State Legislature appropriated $5,000 to establish the California Poultry Experiment Station on land given by who else but George McNair. The research, much of which was funded by the state and federal governments, concentrated on poultry pathology, nutrition, and parasitology. In 1915, the UC Extension, University of California Extension, established the Livestock and Poultry Pathology Laboratory in Petaluma, which was allegedly the only one of its kind. And then, of course, there was the chicken pharmacy. Alice showed an image of that postcard earlier in this presentation, which, even according to National Geographic, was the world's only chicken pharmacy. Innovations in packing and transporting eggs allowed for large-scale egg packing plants. This is an interior of Nye and Nissen. Postcards were also used to promote Petaluma, to encourage growth and development, and as a vehicle for boosterism. Trying to emerge from a post-World War I slump, the Chamber of Commerce hired a publicist to promote Petaluma. Bert Kerrigan devised a marketing plan to pitch Petaluma as the world's egg basket. He declared a National Egg Day in 1917 and went from there. This image shows a float in front of the Palace Hotel in San Francisco. Kerrigan found parades to be effective publicity. This particular photo is from 1918 when he was promoting National Egg Day. This popular postcard promoted eggs and the poultry industry in Petaluma. In theory, high-producing hens like white leghorns could lay 1,000 eggs in their lifetime, but were generally culled once their production began to taper. Commencing in 1918, Petaluma celebrated Egg Day with all sorts of festivities, including parades, carnivals, circuses, rodeos, free barbecues, and expensive contests, including the best egg recipes, tug of war, and selected egg royalty. The queen was crowned Henrietta, and the king was Chanticleer. This image from 1923 is in front of the old St. Vincent's Church. It shows a giant ostrich chick hatching from an egg, driving a team of men dressed as roosters. As an aside, the Petaluma Incubator Company often used the hatching of exotic eggs like ostriches as a publicity stunt. There are many postcards of parades in Petaluma. This postcard by Cam and Hedges Brooder House includes dozens of live baby chicks fenced in the foreground. The white leghorn was the hen of choice in Petaluma due to her very high egg production. In the early years of promoting Petaluma, this giant hen was used on many floats and is pictured here parked just outside the Petaluma depot. And in doing research, we found that she had a name. She was called Chanticleer. At this point, we're going to end our presentation, conclude with the reading of a short poem we found published in the Argus Courier in 1941, written by W.O. Manwaring, and it's called Petaluma Hen. I am a leghorn hen, proudly I stand, for in the march of men to pioneer this land, millions upon millions of my clan served unceasingly, laid increasingly to build for man. Our feathered numbers ever growing like wild, living waters flowing through Sonoma's rolling hills, and with us grew its stores and mills. Grew a little country town, grew a place of world renown, grew Petaluma, city of men, built by Her Majesty, the Hen.
That was so awesome. Thank you both so much. We do have quite a few questions. So are you ready?
Yes.
All right. First, a question from a lot of people is, how do you preserve and care for vintage postcards?
Yes, there's, I put them in little sleeves, and then I put them in boxes. So a lot of times, and the sleeves can be archival, preserves the postcard. And the great thing about collecting postcards is they don't take a lot of room, such as, people collect bigger things. And so, our entire, postcard collection is in one big box. So that's, and then sometimes, you can use index cards to categorize them.
Thank goodness they're not too large. So another question from Jules, they're wondering, what is it about postcards that are unique compared to contemporary photographs?
Yeah, Well, we talked about it a little bit, you know, the things that are on postcards and the purpose that they're used for. But the thing is that you can share postcards, and you know, people don't collect postcards as much anymore. People don't send postcards as much anymore. So, you know, the message that you can write on the back is I started calling it the original social media, right? Where you do a quick message and there's an image and then you send it off. So but postcards were a little bit more personal because you got them into your mailbox. So that's a unique thing about postcards is that you share them with other people like we do in social media now, as opposed to photographs.
Right. A question from Ed, is the library that you showed a Carnegie library, or were the funds from something other than Carnegie?
It was a Carnegie library, and it was a great honor for Petaluma to be able to build a Carnegie library. Petaluma had to raise matching funds, which they did. So Addie Atwater was the name of the woman who scouted and hounded their stories about her with the local business owner, raised to the Carnegie Library, also donated the land.
Interesting. I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit there. Do you mind just repeating the last sentence?
Oh, sure. Just that she also donated the land for the Carnegie Library, and it's now the Petaluma History Museum.
Got it.
Library building.
Got it. Thanks for repeating that. Bailey is wondering for both of you, what was the most surprising thing that you both learned about Petaluma?
But what do you think?
Well, for me, there was a lot of, because I'm relatively new, so there was a lot for me to learn there. You know, I'd heard about the poultry industry too, and I mean, I just learned so much, you know, in every kind of direction. So, but you know, same kind of thing. World Egg Basket. I thought that was just something that a promotional thing, which it was, but definitely poultry was huge.
Yeah, and for me too, I think learning, I always thought it was, you know, boasting that Petaluma was the world's egg basket or the poultry center. And come to find out, it was a pretty well substantiated claim. I also was I'm surprised to learn that Petaluma was the third largest waterway, shipping waterway in California in the mid to late 1800s, because it was a creek. It's very muddy. They used some of the postcards showed scow schooners, which are flat bottom boats. And because they're kind of flat bottom, they float more evenly on the surface. And that was also flat bottom because when the tide was out in the Petaluma Creek, they would hit a sandbar. And the flat bottom allowed the boat to stay upright and stable and not flop to the side. So they really had to work hard to make the Petaluma tidal slough be a working shipping way. And it was the third largest in California because of all the industry in Petaluma shipping things downriver.
Wow. Wow. You kind of touched on this in the presentation, but Maggie's wondering, how hard was it to find these old postcards?
So that's one advantage to postcards. You know, Alice said they're like the new social media, but with current social media, because of computers, it's easy to put keywords in. So actually, it wasn't that difficult to find these with internet searches. eBay got a lot of our money, although postcards aren't terribly expensive. But because of the indexing electronically, it wasn't that hard to find them. And I'll let Alice speak to that too, because she's collected postcards of other areas to see if, was it more difficult for you finding postcards of Petaluma?
Yeah, I think, you know, I did a Stockton book, and I collected Stockton postcards, and it's a bigger city, and so there's more postcards of it. And but there were enough of Petaluma, and able to have contributions from the library, from the museum, as well as the 3 postcard collectors who've been collecting postcards for a very, very long time.
An anonymous attendee, this is a great question. Do you have any idea how the cover postcard photograph was taken?
Ooh, good question.
Back to that, and we can take a look at it. Everybody can see it. It certainly looks like it had to be taken from a high vantage point, doesn't it?
That's a good question.
That's a good
Before
question.
drones.
Maybe a ladder on top of a building or something. I'm really not sure. It's a good question.
Oops, sorry. I'm just funneling through. We have so many of the same questions, lots of interest here. So which postcard in your book was the hardest to find and acquire?
Well, basically, we scouted out postcards without necessarily knowing if there was one that we hadn't seen that we really wanted. We were able to use postcards to scour through the collections for the Sonoma County and also at the History Museum. And Alice has something to add as well.
Yeah, we'd heard about the dairy industry, and so it was important for us to include dairy postcards. And we had a hard time finding, and there's a couple in the book, but I felt that was kind of tough, finding postcards of the dairy. So there were certain things, you know, the winery and the breweries, and I mean, there's certain buildings that they just didn't make.
Yeah, and we've been asked. Petaluma had a lot of immigrant groups coming in. Portuguese, Italians, and then there were the Jewish chicken ranchers. And there aren't very many postcards of any of those ethnic groups. So that's kind of interesting too.
Yeah. We have another great question from an anonymous attendee. Generally, postcards today show historical places, landmarks, and scenic sites. It's interesting to see that some of the early postcards show businesses and warehouses. What was the purpose of these? Was it to promote businesses?
It was in part, but it was also to show the prosperity of a town, I think. So I think it was advertising, but more than that. For example, postcards of schools were, like Alice said, they're in every town. You can find old postcards of schools. I'm not sure they're making postcards of schools anymore. That's not considered a noteworthy thing. So I do think the images promoted in postcards has changed over time.
Huh. Maggie is wondering if you guys, either of you know why they decided to tear down the Victorian building. It was so beautiful.
It was. I'll let Alice talk about that, the Civic Hall, City Hall.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics, but you know, I mean, it's during the like I said, during the 50s, we really started like urban renewal and started looking at buildings. Earthquake safety. That's a lot of the school buildings are not used for schools anymore because of those reasons. So the idea was to, it was quite controversial at the time. And the idea was, right now it just is a parking lot. The idea was to build something else, and it never came about.
Okay, we've got just a few. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
But then that actually, the tearing down of the City Hall spurred a whole movement in Petaluma for building preservation. So folks were upset enough about it being torn down. So the good outcome of that is that there was then a lot more attention focused on preserving historic buildings.
It's good. It's a great cause. So we only have a few more, but I do want to touch on them. An anonymous attendee is wondering if old postcards are copyright protected.
They're not. After the old ones are not. There's a particular date. Do you remember the year, Alice?
Yeah.
If it doesn't have a copyright thing on the back, then it's not. That's the easiest way to tell. When they first started being copyrighted, they have that little insignia. But none of the postcards we use in our book are copyrighted because they all predate the copyright.
That's great. Okay, so this last question about the book, what percentage of the postcards featured in the book are from your private collection? And are you continuing to collect specific Petaluma postcards?
Oh, we are continuing, that's for sure.
Yes, I think it's about 75% of the postcards are from our collection, and so 25% are supplemented. And you know, since publishing the books, we have found some nice gem postcards, and we're like, oh, wish we could have put it in the book. We did create a Facebook page specifically for our books, and so we will start posting some of the postcards that we continue to acquire over time, and so we'll continue to share those with
And if you guys wanted to share the link for that, either with me or in the chat, I can go ahead and include it in the follow-up email so people can find you.
Okay. It's just Petaluma in Vintage Postcards on Facebook.
Great. Okay, the last question that lots of people want to know is, what is next? Are you working on a new book? What's coming up in your near future?
So that's a great question. Well, the first thing we usually say is we need a break first. I have an interest. We found so much on the parades and promoting Petaluma, all these goofy pictures of people dressed up as chickens and things. So I could see something on that. I'm very interested in local history and will continue to do that. Alice is pivoting a bit more to the wine industry, including looking at tasting rooms and other aspects of the wine industry. So that's kind of where we're at now. But first, we're taking a breather.
That sounds fun. Hopefully when that comes out, no rush, but we'll be back in person and we can have you under the same roof as us, and that would be great. For all of you who are wondering, yes, a recording will be available. If you heard nothing else tonight, everything will be included in tomorrow's email, a link for the recording, how to purchase tonight's title, which currently is only available in our Petaluma store. That doesn't mean you have to go in there. You just need to call. I'll share the number again and in the email, and they can either deliver it to you or we can ship it to your preferred location of Copperfields to pick up. I appreciate both of you being with us tonight. It was a perfect topic for a Friday night, nice wind down. Any last things you'd like to say?
I guess I just wanted to point out that it was really hard narrowing down the postcards for this book. There were so many great ones to choose from. And we didn't use nearly all the ones in our collection either. So I just wanted to point that out. And this project was so much fun. It was a hoot.
You'll have to release little by little Petaluma Part 2 in your Facebook.
There we go.
How about you, Alice? Any last words?
No, I'm very grateful for people joining us on this Friday evening. Thank you.
Great. And I forgot it was Friday. I apologize. The email will come on Monday. So don't be worried if it doesn't come tomorrow. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time around.
Thanks, Jamie.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.